Everybody have a note card? Okay. Everybody get it in the back? All right.
Do you need pencils? Does everybody have a writing utensil?
Yeah, go get one as we're thinking about this. So our next topic we're looking at today is sufficient grace. Thank you. So grace is abundant, we just said, but it's also sufficient. I want you to think about this with your card, okay? We're going to take a time. I'll let Jared get back in here for this part, but 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, Paul says, but to me, he said, this we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, if you want to start turning over there. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Okay? So he says, therefore I'm going to boast all the more gladly of my weakness so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So we're going to look at Paul's claim in here about his labeling grace and how he says that God has told him it's sufficient for him, even though there's this thorn. So what is this thorn that he has? So we're going to talk about our thorns that we have, and where do they come from? What do we do with them? What does this word sufficient mean? So that's what we're going to spend some time doing. But we're going to do something with this card. This is your card, and I want you to look around this room. How many of y'all are from out of town? So this may be something you have to visualize in your own youth group back home. But we're going to take some time to vote out one person in your youth group, okay? Serious, today. You have a card. You all get a vote. It's America. You're going to write down the name of one person in your youth group that you want out. Like, they're done. We're going to add these up. We're going to give them to Jared when he comes back. And the one with the most votes, they're out, okay? You're out of the youth group. Keep it to yourself. It's your vote. Don't try to sway other people's vote, okay? Whatever person you're like, that person really rubs me the wrong way. I'm really sick of this person. They got to go. It would be a lot easier in our youth group if this person wasn't in it, right? Maybe you got a name already. Maybe you're trying to narrow down 3 or 4 names because you're like, well, they're really annoying too, and I don't know who I'd write. It's a lot, right? Who are you going to write? Who are you going to vote out of your youth group? All right. If you can get rid of the most annoying person in it, popular vote wins. This person's gone. We'll kick them out right now. They won't even finish this class. How about that? Right? Sound great? Everybody want to do that?
Does that have to be somebody in the class now? Or
Someone you don't even want to come Sunday. Like, yep, sorry, you're voted out. We'll send them a text. Be like, listen, you weren't here, but this happened. So, listen, for real, don't write that down, okay? You probably like, whoops, if you did, you have a pencil. I hope you erase that. Cross that out. But wouldn't that be something you want to do sometimes, right? You're like, we get to vote someone out, and they're gone for real. They don't get to exist in this group anymore. I have to deal with them ever again. Isn't that what we sometimes really want? I mean, I'll be honest with you, I've graduated a lot of kids in youth groups for 20 years. And some of them, I wasn't as sad as others to see leave, okay? Because they cause a lot of problems in my life and in our youth group. And some of them were just, we're friends now. We talk. We're still, I still keep in touch with them. But as a teenager, man, there were a lot to deal with, okay? And wouldn't we want them removed instead of the grace to deal with them? Which one would you pick if you had a choice? The thorn or grace? And I hope when you get to the end of this, we're going to get to the end of this section in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. I hope you see the benefit of grace and know that it's sufficient for you in all situations, even with people, right? Even when thorns come and you say, I would rather be done with this. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a situation. Maybe it's a thing that you're dealing with in your life, and you'd rather remove it. And if you could vote to remove that, or if God said, do you want to remove it, or do you want the grace to deal with it? Which one would you pick? Let's read this part, the whole part, okay, because we read verse 9, but let's read 7 through 10. Someone read that for us? So let's get the context of all that Paul is talking about when he informs us of grace being sufficient. I'm going to read that for us. I know it's a Saturday and you don't want to read. Go ahead. You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you should rather turn to forgive and comfort him, so he may be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. So I beg you to refer.
Are you in 2 Corinthians?
Yeah.
Chapter 12? Okay. All right. Still a good part of the Bible. Nothing wrong with reading other parts. Chapter 12, verse 7. We're going to give him some grace. Okay, yeah, practicing.
So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I may content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities.
Those calamites, man, right?
For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Okay. What do you think Paul says? What do you think he means by thorn? He says, I wasn't want to become conceited, so it was a thorn given me in the flesh. Right? What do you think he means by thorn? He literally fell in the woods and came out man, it's thorns. It's not literal, right? He doesn't have literal thorns on him. So what is his thorns? What do you mean by that? Okay, weaknesses. Yeah, this is a good guess. All right, I'll tell you. We'll get to the end of this. There's no consensus on the answer. How about that? So what do you think as you hear that? A temptation, an annoyance. Okay. All right. Any other guesses on that? Yep. A pain? Like a physical pain or emotional pain? Yeah? Okay. So we got a lot of things that maybe could be thorns, right? What would you say are your thorns? It's more specific, right? That's harder to answer than Paul's, right? It's easy to talk about somebody else. What about yours? Okay. How many of y'all, just show of hands, this may be an easy way to answer it. How many of y'all would say the things we just mentioned about Paul's thorns could be your thorns? Right? Temptations, emotional pain, all the things that we just talked about being something that Paul may deal with that may be yours too. And here's the thing, we're not sure what Paul's thorn is. And you go read 1,000 commentaries and they're going to make up things and talk about things. We don't know is the answer. Paul doesn't tell you. It'd be a lot easier if in chapter 12 he'd just say, here's my thorn. He just calls it this. He doesn't tell you what it is. We do know a lot about Paul's life. We got a lot of things in his life. We speculate about some other places he writes things, about his large handwriting, about maybe it's a physical something, a disability he may have that he received. Here's what we do see. Go back, look at this chapter 11 right before this. So something you won't see if you're looking at your Bible on your phone. You don't see the whole page. So I always encourage you, bring your own to class, read. I read my Bible on my phone too, but you miss some of it that you're going to see in a bigger picture. So when I ask this question to myself, I said, what is he talking about? Go back to chapter 11, and he's going to talk about all these physical things, right? He's boasting. Verse 23, am I talking about my imprisonments, countless beatings, near death? 5 times I received the hand of the Jews, 40 times the lash, 40 minus 1. It's where you at 40 lashes, so they stop at 39. This is the point where people are likely to die. 3 times he's beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. I would stop getting on boats. A night and a day adrift at sea. He's frequent dangers from rivers and robbers and his own people. Dangers from the Gentiles in the city, in the wilderness, at sea. I don't know where Paul goes where he's not in danger, it sounds like. Danger from false brothers. He's in toil and hardship through many sleepless nights. He's in hunger and thirst, and often without food and cold and exposure. And then he says, in many, apart from all these other things, there's this daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. And this is one list. Paul gives you another list in another book where he starts talking about these physical things that happen to him, right? I mean, this is an unbelievable list of physical things. Maybe his story is one of them, where he received some of this and had now some physical problems. He talks about, in verse 28 there, this mental anxiety he has that he carries around, that weighs on him for the weight of all of these churches that he works with. And I feel that as a minister, you feel this weight from working with people and knowing things about their lives and worrying about people. And so Paul's dealing with that on a huge level, right? That he's writing this with this weight. So it may be one of those things. We don't know. He's talking about all these pressures. He's talking about all these sufferings. Paul's got lots of thorns, is probably what we can conclude. But he's writing about one specifically, one major one, that he's asking God to remove. He's asking him 3 times. And I don't know about you, but I relate to this, like, God, if you could just take this away. And I don't know why God doesn't. He did it with Paul. He does it with us. He leaves some thorns in our lives. And Paul's asking him, and our thorns may be other people, may be physical problems, it may be limitations that you have, maybe temptations, it may be emotions, maybe fears, places and ways that you fall short too often. And he's not always saying this is, I assume it isn't, though, Paul's continual sin. I don't think that's, y'all mentioned temptation, but not continual sinning. I don't think we call that a thorn, right? But here's what I would say if you're writing something down. Our thorns are anything that make us see the need to rely on God. If we're saying this is a thorn, it's anything that is making us see the need to rely on God. When he talks about it and thinks about this thorn, where is he going with it? He's going to God in prayer and asking God to remove it. So he's aware of this thorn, and he's making the fact that God is saying, here's your answer to this thorn. My grace is sufficient for you. All of our thorns, though, they embody suffering. What does the Bible say about suffering? Anything Paul's going to define as his thorn or you're going to define as yours, you're going to have suffering related to it. What does the Bible say about suffering? He says, Paul writes in another letter, it produces perseverance, and perseverance leads to hope. And he says, you're not going to receive this kind of hope. It's not just, I hope it works out. It's a hope that you're going to make it through. It's not a disappointing hope. It's a hope that leads to grace. The Bible never guarantees you happiness. It never says you're going to be happy. It instead says, Jesus tells you to expect suffering. That's what he promises. If you're going to follow me, if they hated you, they're going to hate me. If they hate me, they're going to hate you. He says you're going to follow Jesus. It's going to be hard. There's going to be things about our faith that will be tested over and over again. And it's not a teenage thing, it's a human thing. You're going to continue to be tested as you grow up in new ways, with new things and new thorns. If you're going to have a faith that lasts, he says, I want you to rely on the sufficient grace of God to deal with all the things that discourage you. because they're going to come, and you're going to want to quit. You're going to want to stop following God because you're going to blame Him for these thorns. You're going to blame Him for not removing them. And His answer He's giving you through them is going to be the same He's given to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you. Right? Because thorns often, and we read this long part here, thorns often come, we didn't read this yet. Okay. Thorns often come from people, right? Most of the things that I am discouraged by are because of my interactions with people. And often my interactions with people are in church, because what I do. But that may be where your thorns come from, people. And it sadly may be from people in the church. So people are hard to deal with. Do things that I don't understand. But I've been hurt by more people in the church than probably anything else in my life. And that's hard to accept. But I know that I'm not hurt by God. I'm hurt by people, right? And there's a difference. That I may be disappointed with people in the church, but that doesn't mean I'm disappointed with the church. Because God has paid for that with blood. And He wants you to be a part of it. But Paul writes this, and he says, here's how. If they're my thorns, if they're part of what we're dealing with, let's look at what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So I read this part for us. We're going to start in verse 14 through verse 27. I know this is probably the longest one we'll read all day. Who's got this one?
And it's
1 Corinthians, yes. So if you're still in 2nd, go back a book. We'll come back to 2 Corinthians.
For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? The whole body, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God has arranged the members in the body, each one of them as He chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow greater honor, and on our unrepresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body to give greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it.
How many of you have heard this before, read this before, right? How hard is this to accept that this is what we're supposed to live out? Because again, this isn't about belief, it's about action. If this doesn't move you to action, then what are we reading it for? You know, what's he saying about us, about the church? Can you look at each other and say, I don't need you? You attempted to do that when we started this class. You have a piece of paper in your hand, you're going to write a name down. You were contemplating it, right? I saw it on your face. Don't lie about it. You were thinking of this person that you want to get rid of and walk out the door and like, yes, they're never going to come back. This is getting real, for real. This guy, that's what we want, right? That would be easier. And Paul says, let me tell you something about the body. You can't look at anyone in it and say to them, to their face, I don't need you. Think about that. He says it 3 times. We need each other. You can't look at a person and say, well, they're not that important in my life. They're not that useful in our group. They're not that encouraging to other people. He says you can't get rid of people because you don't like them, because they're a thorn in your life. That's not how it works in the church. That's not what I died to give you. He purchased 2 things, you and the church. And I think we look at people and say, well, they have no value in my life. Or worse, they've stolen value from me. They don't treat me with any value. So why should I treat them with value? This is a world viewpoint. That's how we look at people. That's how the world looks at people. God doesn't look at people like that. He looks at people like this. They're indispensable. Those are the words he's using. You have to treat each one of them. They may seem weaker, they may seem worthless, but not in God's eyes. You know, we used to have parts of our body, we'd call them vestigial organs. And when we started studying the body, we would say, I have no idea what that part does. So we don't need it in our body, and we can remove it. It's a vestigial organ. It has no purpose in your body. Feel free to take it out. And they started doing that. They started removing random organs in their body. They didn't know really what they did. We were early on studying the body, and then they found out when they removed it, oh, that thing did some very important things. I had no idea. It's not a vestigial organ. It's a very personal and useful part of your body, and you cannot get rid of it. Stop taking it out. And now guess what? This list of vestigial organs doesn't exist. Because the longer they've studied the body, they've realized God put every single part in you, 3,000 pieces together, and you need every one of them. Right? My daughter, she's 8, she loves to build Lego sets, and you lose that one little tiny piece. You're like, I can't build this. I need that one piece. And we look all over the floor, all over everything. We're trying to find that one little square that builds the entire rest of it. And it didn't seem as important when we started than all the other cool pieces in there. But man, I can't build this without that one little thing. That's each other, and that's the way God wants you to look at each other. You can't say to anyone, I have no need of you. That's it. He says that should never come out of your mouth. That's not graceful. And we might look at people with no value, and I do this, I'm guilty of it, and say, I want to push them away because I think they have no value in my life. I might miss the value I bring to their life, right? By removing myself from their life. Say, you know what, I'm just going to quietly have nothing to do with them. I'm not even going to tell them that. That's just going to be my silent attitude towards this person. And you might be doing that in this group. And God's saying that's not the attitude you have towards each other. It's not the attitude I have towards you. So why the thorns? Back to 2 Corinthians. If you're in 1st, go back to 2nd. He says in chapter 4, our youth group is called JAR Youth because we have Johnson, Arkansas, so it kind of helps out. But it also, our verse for our youth group comes out of this, a verse out of 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He says that we have these jars of clay. Somebody read this for us. Chapter 4, verse 7 through 11. Yeah, go ahead.
We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God, not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the life of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who love are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested.
Okay. When we add this verse, we added the phrase, imperfect vessels showing perfect power. So that's our tagline for our youth group, because I think it really sums up who we are and what we're supposed to be doing. We are imperfect vessels. He said you're in this jar of clay, and you're showing perfect power. And even in your imperfection, when we're not the graceful people we should be, God's power is still able to be seen through us. And he wants you to see yourself in this, that what are you carrying, right? I can't remove the thorns sometimes, but I still admit they're there. And he says, in your imperfection, God's going to meet you with grace. I admit that I have imperfections. I think we all should do that. When you do that, you're showing you're this imperfect vessel. And what is he saying he's going to do with an imperfect vessel? Use it to show perfect power. So when he's talking about this affliction, we are not perfect. We may be afflicted in every single way. We may be crushed, but we're not perplexed. It gets to the edge of all these things. You're driven to despair, but you're not persecuted. You're persecuted, but you're not forsaken. You're struck down, but you weren't destroyed by it. You're carrying around the body of Jesus every time. You're showing the perfect gospel of grace that he's saying is manifested in your body. When they look at your life, they say, that's an imperfect person. You say, absolutely. But I'm showing perfect power, that God's power is shown in my weakness. And this is what Paul claims about his thorns. When I have to deal with them, when I have to show them, when I have to live with them, I'm showing that God's grace is sufficient. Right? I'm teaching other people about grace. God's power is shown in Paul when he says, here's my thorn. And I'm telling you about it to show you I'm my thorn and to have this pity from you, but to show my weakness. Because if I can show you my weakness, I can show you where God's power makes up for it, where it is sufficient. When you and I show our weakness, at the same time we do that, we're showing God's power. And that's what he wants people to see. When we talk about all these things that didn't take us down, right? We confirm the grace and the strength of God. We tell people, look, this is what I am, this is what I go through, but here's what God made me able to be because of it, right? Your life and my life is a walking billboard that advertises the sufficient and the abundant grace of God. Either people see that through you because of the way you live and act and treat people, or they're going to see you. They're not going to see God. They're not going to see grace. They're not going to see the gospel. They're going to see you. And we got to get out of the way if they're going to see grace. When they look at our lives, that's what they need to see. God's grace is enough. So chapter 12, verse 9, he says that God's power rests on Paul because of his weakness. What does he spend time telling people about that he is able to explain to us, right? What if Paul didn't have this thorn? What would Paul maybe be tempted to do if he didn't have this thorn? If he wasn't in this chapter talking about weakness or his thorn. Yeah. Yeah. Boasting, right? For sure. What about us? What would become of us without our thorns? You have no challenges, no difficulties. I mean, that sounds great, right? You've no struggle.
You wouldn't have to rely on God.
Yeah. You can do everything by yourself. You wouldn't even think about it, would you? I can do everything by myself. Nothing bothers me. Nothing's hard for me. Nothing's ever in the way. Everyone is amazing. But that's not the reality, right? Things are hard. People are difficult. It's always going to be that way. What do we do with them? If not, turn to God who's full of grace and gives us that to deal with them. And so Paul's tempted, if he would be, to say, let's talk about boasting. Because here's the deal with boasting. If you take a wider look at this section, he's going to talk. In fact, I went through my Bible and highlighted, I don't know if you can see that in yellow, all the places that talk about boasting 20 times in 3 chapters. He's giving this idea of boasting. We're very tempted to boast. Talk about what we're doing. Talk about how good we are. Amazing. Or this is Paul talking about it. Boasting. And we can't talk about thorns, and we can't talk about sufficient, because that's the name of this class, is sufficient grace. In the middle of those two things is boasting. It's in the way. I tried to read around it. I couldn't. And I kept highlighting it. I'm like, man, I'm trying to read about grace. I'm trying to read about sufficient grace. And I couldn't move this word out of the way. Paul does it. He puts it in there over and over again. I'm going to talk about boasting because I've talked about my thorns. And if it wasn't there, this is what I'd be doing. Look, if you go back through this, through all the way to chapter 10. And we're not going to read 3 chapters. Okay, so don't worry. But here's what he's saying. Here's what I want to boast about, Paul says. You go to chapter 10. He says, I want to boast about my authority. Right? Chapter 10, verse 8. I wish I could talk about my authority. He says, I would boast about my background, being an apostle, being a super apostle, he even calls himself, right? I'd boast about that if I could, if I would. He says, I want to compare how God helped him achieve all these things. And he at all this, if I get down to chapter 12, verse 5, here's what he says about boasting. Here's my conclusion. Here's how, if I could boast about all these things that happened to me, the heritage I have, all the things that I am, my authority, my apostleship, I would narrow it down to this, chapter 12, verse 5. Let those who boast, boast in the Lord. I'm sorry, that's chapter 10, verse 17. But in chapter 12, verse 5, he says, I'm going to boast about one thing, my weakness. That's not really something we're like, man, I'm going to brag about my weakness. I mean, how many of us are like, I'm going to pick something to boast about. It's like, you know how many pull-ups I can do? I mean, you know how good I am, how fast I am? I mean, we're going to brag about things that we are proud of, that we want people to know about us. And if I went around the room and say, hey, let's tell us one thing that you want other people to know about you, it's probably going to be something you're bragging about, something you're proud of about yourself. And that's not bad. Paul's saying, if I want to boast, it's going to be one thing. In other words, he says there's only one thing worth boasting about. In chapter 10, verse 17, I'm going to boast in the Lord. I'm going to boast about what God has done. I'm going to talk about these things that God is doing in my life. Are you boasting about that? Because this is Paul's story. I once was blind, but now I see. I once was dead, but now I'm alive. Romans chapter 6. He writes about these things because he's lived these things. This is how he talks about himself and God. I was this way, and now I'm this way because of the grace of God. Boasting about ourselves, where does it get you? Does it get you anywhere? I mean, maybe you get someone's phone number, maybe someone thinks better of you, but really, is that what we want? Is that our goal? Or Paul says, boasting about God, where does that get us? What does that accomplish? If you're going to boast, he says, boast about the Lord. What does it accomplish boasting about what God has done in your life? What does that achieve? Yeah. Yeah. Which God says is the whole focus of why you're here, to give glory to him. And that's pretty amazing. But he tells you too, to speak about, when I boast, I'm going to talk about the sufficient grace of God, right? Let's look at this word. What does sufficient mean? It's not an English class, so it doesn't have to be exact. Yeah. Okay. Anybody agree with that? It's a good statement. Yeah. Okay. Any other words? That's what I thought, and that's probably how I define it. Very understandable way. Here's how, and I looked it up in the Greek. I'm not a Greek scholar. I just have a dictionary. And this was a surprise to me when I got here. I said, this can't be the definition. And I'm going to read it exactly how it was written because it's an old definition. But it says, here's what this word sufficient means. Namely, you have it up here, to enable you to bear evil manfully. Don't be offended, this is the dictionary. There is therefore no reason why you should ask for its removal. I didn't add that second sentence. That was in the dictionary. And I was like, you guys are kidding, that's in the dictionary. It's crazy that this is not, it's not just enough. He says it is exactly what you need to bear evil like a man. I mean, that sounds weird if you're a lady reading that. If you're a man, you're like, yeah, you're like a man. If you're a girl, you're like, he's saying, look, this is enough. It's equal to what men receive in their strength. I mean, this is like, if we're talking about bearing evil manfully, I don't even know why we use that word. Y'all should start using that. But think about this. It's because of grace that we have this weakness. He's saying, I want you to see in your grace, he calls it grace. You have always enough. That's what grace is. You never miss anything you need to survive the things that we go through. We have grace. Not just grace. He calls it what? What kind of grace? Sufficient grace. Right? God's adjective for grace. It's sufficient. It's enough to help you bear evil. Why would you ask for its removal. What did we say at the beginning of this class? That you were either going to ask, would I remove the thorn or would I remove the grace? If you had to choose between grace and the thorns, which one would you get rid of? I don't know about you, but I'm not getting rid of grace. Right? Sufficient grace, it means that God is doing things that we have a way to get through them. He doesn't get tired of helping you do these things when they're hard. He says it may be even impossible. Definition means it's impossible without his help. When I'm helpless, God makes me able. This is this word. God is calling this kind of grace sufficient grace. It means God gives you the exact strength and mercy and forgiveness and patience that you need to endure every second with people who are insufferable. You get it. He's going to give it to you. You say, I can't stand another moment in this van with this kid. And he says, guess what? I'm going to give you sufficient grace. So yes, you can. You can endure it. You can persevere. There's not a moment you're ever lacking perseverance. And I know I wouldn't have a faith right now if it wasn't for the sufficient grace of God, who allowed me to endure things that I thought, I'm done. I don't want to tolerate any more of this. I want out. And he says, you're not getting out. I'm going to give you exactly what you need to bear evil. Here's our verse as we end, guys. For the sake of Christ, therefore, Paul says, I'm content with weakness, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions, calamities. I'm weak, and then I'm strong. Paul didn't just claim this without the sufficient grace of God. He couldn't say this without that. And he wouldn't believe it. He says if grace is absent, then you just have what? Weakness. Grace, he's going to just be left with this thorn, this weakness, insufferable thorn. No way to deal with it. He says, I don't know what, and God remove it. That's what he's been saying. God says, I'm not going to remove it. I'm going to give you exactly what you need to fight it, to live with it. And he says, this strength comes from sufficient grace. If this is enough today in a prison to go through all this list that we read about things that he's dealt with, isn't it enough to sit in the same room with people we have a hard time with? Right? That may be a little annoying. It's nothing like Paul's list. And he dealt with these people who just stoned him to death. And as soon as he was physically able to drag himself back to their city to preach again, why can't I? There are people watching you that know you have thorns, right? They have their own thorns. And you showing them God has given you sufficient grace to deal with it, you're showing them they have a way to deal with their thorns, right? And that's enough. I want you to do something weird as we end. I want you to close your eyes for a second. And I want you to repeat this sentence with me. His grace is sufficient for me. His grace is sufficient for me. Let's pray. God, we just thank you for your sufficient grace. And Father, we know that we need that, and we deal with the thorns that we have, Father, that you may or may not remove in our lives. And we thank you for giving that to us so we have a way to make it through. Thank you for your grace. In the name we pray.